Well, welcome everyone to Kennedy Mbeva's completion seminar for his PhD. It's on a very topical issue, and Kennedy's research for his PhD has been on the environmental aspects of preferential trading agreements. I should say at the beginning that I'm Andrew Walter and I'm the chair of Kennedy's panel, Professor of International Relations in the School of Social and Political Sciences. I understand that quite possibly Kennedy's supervisors, Robin Eckersley and Yevgeny Posnikov, are also in attendance, so I can't see them at the moment. Anyway, Kennedy will speak for up to 40 minutes, so we want to allow 20 minutes for Q&A. So please do that. Please ask your questions. You can, if you wish, type your questions into the chat function, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. But we will be having the Q&A session once Kennedy completes his presentation. So Kennedy, why don't I hand straight over to you so that we can get going.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you everyone for attending my completion seminar today. I'm very happy to share with you the progress of my PhD research for the last 3 years or so. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'll be presenting on, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend my respect to other Indigenous Australians present. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank my supervisors, Robin Eckersley and Evgeny Posnikov, for the support that has enabled me to get to this point, and to Andrew Walter for making sure that I jump the hoops on time. And thank you to everyone else, people at the Climate College, for being such a good group and offering a good space. School of Social and Political Science for being my academic home, and my many other friends in the different circles, including Africa Studies Group. A huge thank you to everyone. As they say, it takes a village to get someone through something, and I really appreciate all the people. So without much ado, I'll take you through my presentation and summarize some of my key findings for the last 3 years or so. So first, my presentation will look at an introduction, and that'll be giving you an overview of what actually motivated my project. Second, I'll give a background of the issues, what are some of the debates about the topic, and why, what are some of the origins. I'll take you through my theory about, that's how I think about the problem. And from there, we'll switch to the empirics. And I'll, first of all, take you through the first analysis of, why are we seeing a trend where certain type of trade agreements, such as preferential trade agreements, including environmental clauses. So I think from there, we'll take a deep dive into a case study and look at an example of a trade agreement in practice, and how it's dealing with climate policy issues. From there, we'll conclude, draw some insights from the study, and have insights into the future outlook. So let's go to the introduction. What was the motivation for this study? So when I started, trade policy wasn't that big of a topic. It was in academic circles, but not very much in the public domain. But then once upon a time, there was a tariff man. And the tariff man made a very infamous statement that trade was easy to win. And Donald Trump, as you're aware, when he was elected, he's been using tariffs to pursue quite a number of foreign policy objectives. And tariffs are a very potent instrument of trade policy. And I think the big point there to note is that trade policy is a very potent or very important policy tool. But also, Donald Trump is a climate laggard. He pulled the US out of the landmark Paris Agreement. So the US is the only country that has not signed onto the agreement. And he doesn't care much about the environment. So you can see on the one hand, trade policy is playing a very important role. It's a very powerful tool. But on the other hand, it's being used for some other reasons, and not for some of the things that many people care about, including climate. But on the other side of the debate, there are those who are looking at trade agreements as maybe the perfect climate weapon. And this is happening in the backdrop where countries are really struggling to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change. So there's a big discussion on whether trade agreements can actually help to strengthen global climate action. So is it the perfect climate weapon? Recently, the EU made a sort of a commitment to include climate change in all its agreements and trade agreements. And one of the big controversies was the friction with Brazil. Brazil elected a president who threatened to quit from the Paris Agreement following the US. But then the EU made agreeing to the trade deal contingent on the country staying in the Paris Agreement. Closer home in Australia, there's been a lot of friction between Europe and Australia over a proposed trade deal. And part of that friction is from the climate demands in that trade deal. And maybe last but not least, in the US elections, the issue of climate change has been quite an issue, especially for the Democratic nominations. And Bernie Sanders slammed the new NAFTA, which is called the USMCA, for not mentioning climate change. So the take-home message is now there's a very renewed focus on trade policy and how it can be used to address environmental problems, most importantly, climate change. So what are preferential trade agreements? Because that'll be the focus of my study. So very simply defined, PTAs, or preferential trade agreements, is an agreement that includes more than one, but less than all nations as members. So very prominent examples include NAFTA, which is now called USMCA, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the recently concluded Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. These are just some of the very prominent examples. When you look at PTAs in the broader trade system, you can call it the second pillar of the international trade system, where the first pillar is the World Trade Organization, which is the multilateral body that has been managing trade the last couple of years. So I'll focus on PTAs for the rest of the presentation because that's the focus of my thesis. So what is the puzzle that animates my study? So first, for the last 3 decades, we've had a huge number of preferential trade agreements being signed. And part of that is it's been very difficult for countries to make progress on many issues at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. So they switched to smaller deals, that is the preferential trade agreements, to try and address many issues. And as you can see from the graph, this is the number of PTAs that has been notified to the World Trade Organization. It's a small number, I think now slightly over 300, but we have many other different types of PTAs. But the key message there is that PTAs, there's been a proliferation of PTAs over the last 3 decades. So digging deeper, we see many of those PTAs have increasingly included clauses on the environment. And what is interesting is initially many of them did not, but some of the early ones did, like NAFTA and some African Economic Community, etc. But over time, we've had that trend picking up and many more PTAs, including environmental clauses. What is more interesting is these clauses didn't seek to do one thing in the trade agreements, that is address environment, but they sought to do multiple things. Which brings us now to my research question, which is animating my project. So what explains the varying approaches of using PTAs to pursue environmental policy objectives? Starting from the premise that we have many many PTAs that mention environment, but they try to approach it from using sort of different policy objectives. So that was a very interesting puzzle that I decided to tackle first in my thesis. And I did that by sort of developing a way of us thinking about the problem, that is theory. So when you look at the theory, I drew mostly from the literature on regime interplay. So simply put, the literature on regime interplay looks at how the interaction of two regimes leads to some outcomes. For example, the trade regime and the environment regime, and when they interact, what are some of the effects? So part of the literature I drew on was from scholars like Oran Yang, who have really written around this topic, and they've shed some light. But the closest sort of literature that was closest to what I was trying to do was by Johnson and Upalainen, which was the theory of regime integration and separation. So they looked at why some regimes separated and others integrated. So built on that literature and developed my very basic but simple theory. And it's built around two concepts. That's the concept of policy spillovers and adjustment costs. What are policy spillovers? So when two the policies from two issue areas, say trade and environment, interact, we have some outcomes. So those outcomes might be, policy conflict, which lead to, like negative spillovers. And for example, if you look at a problem like ozone layer, dealing with the ozone layer, part of the solution to the ozone layer was restricting trade in some of the substances that were actually degrading the ozone layer. So restricting trade goes counter to the main objectives of trade policy, which is to liberalize trade. So the key challenge there is managing the conflict between the two objectives. But on the other hand, countries can try to use one agreement to pursue objectives of another issue area. And that might be, for example, using trade agreements to address environmental policies. For example, using sanctions to improve or enhance compliance in implementation of multilateral and environmental agreements, etc. So the take-home message there is policy spillovers, they can manifest in the form of conflict or in the form of synergy, using one agreement to implement objectives of another agreement. So what are adjustment costs? As the name implies, adjustment costs are the costs incurred in responding to the policy spillovers. When you have policy conflict, of course, you have to manage that conflict, and there are costs incurred with that. The two types of costs, the first is institutional, where states build institutions to try and do something. For example, if we have commitments to address environmental issues in trade agreements, some trade agreements actually create institutions that would follow up or delegate some certain offices in their countries that should follow up the issues. So those are costs involved. Or the cost can be domestic politics. And you can tell from some countries which are trying to address climate policy, for example, they're trying to juggle between the different interest groups in their domestic politics. So when countries try to address either policy conflict or try to use one agreement to pursue objectives of another agreement, they have to think about the domestic policies, which is a cost. Who benefits, who loses? So having that theory, very simple idea of policy spillovers, what happens when two policies interact, and adjustment cost, the cost of responding to them, how does this play in practice? So we now switch to the empirics of my thesis. Recall that I'm looking at PTAs from 1990 all the way to recently, that's like 3 decades. But before looking at that, there were a couple of decades where there was a very big, there were some debates about trade and environment where trade negotiators were, trade policymakers had to start dealing with environmental issues. So how did they do that? So the first major attempt was in 1947 when the GATT, that's the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was formed as an interim body to deal with, manage trade in a multilateral basis. Environmental issues did not feature that strongly, but there was a very small carve-out in the GATT agreement where countries would pursue, of course, trade liberalization, but they had some small space where they could deal with domestic environmental issues. But there was one condition. Those environmental policies had to be consistent with trade rules. So it was trade rules first, a little room to deal with environment, but so long as you keep within certain rules or criteria. But then something happened in 1992 at the very famous UN Rio Conference on Environment and Development. And at the Rio Conference, we had 3 international agreements that were signed, and that they were on climate change, desertification, and biodiversity. And at around that time, countries were negotiating, turning the GATT into what we now know as the WTO. But they could not ignore what was happening, on the environment side with the development of the environmental agreements. So there were a series of 13 debates that took place over a couple of, over 2 years, from 91 to 93, or up to, and I think it spilled over to 94, where trade negotiators debated how could they deal with, these environmental agreements that had come up, and they were using trade measures. There was some aspect of trade policy to it. So the consensus, which sort of was carried into the WTO, was, framed as a compromise of sustainable development, where there would be both policies, trade policy and environmental policy, would support each other. But over the years, jurisprudence from dispute settlement in the WTO has shown that the trade system still deals with environmental issues within sort of the broader scope of trade rules. So having that as the backdrop of the debates that took place before we had a proliferation of PTAs, what are the dynamics that played out? Did we have the same approach that sort of ended up at the WTO where there's a mutual compromise, or did we have the environmental agenda dropping off in PTAs, or did countries actually use PTAs to pursue a stronger environmental policy objectives? So that takes us to the second part of my analysis, where I looked at now 269 PTAs that were concluded between 1990 and 2017. And I had two objectives in this analysis. The first one was to look at, looking at all those trade agreements. If we read the agreements, how do they address sort of like environmental issues? And as I mentioned from my theory, there are two ways they can do so. So it's a very simplified version here. Either a trade-first approach where trade rules are paramount, they're the most important, but we have limited exceptions for dealing with environmental issues. Or on the other hand, what I call the environment-first approach, where countries are deliberately using trade instruments or trade agreements, the PTAs, to pursue environmental policy objectives, regardless of whether they are conflicting with trade rules. So the trade-first approach, of course, tries to deal with the possible policy conflict between trade and environment in trying to minimize that conflict. But the environment-first approach tries to use some of the advantages of the PTA to pursue stronger environmental policy objectives. And what I found from just categorizing the clauses in the trade agreements was, of course, not surprisingly, almost 63% of the clauses were trade first, and only 37% were environment first. So the take-home message for this very simple analysis was, countries are still viewing PTAs, trade agreements, as first and foremost crucial for trade liberalization, expanding trade. Environmental issues, secondary issue, not necessarily the objective of trade agreements. So if we look at this over time, we can see a very interesting trend. And the trend that we see is, initially, we didn't have many trade agreements with environment first clauses, but over time, many PTAs started including the environment first clauses. Some have called these the greening of PTAs. So this is a very interesting trend that we see. And of course, the next question would be, what exactly then is driving this process? Why are we seeing this greening of PTAs? So to do that, I switched to sort of, I think before we go there, I think there's one last point I need to make. And that is that all countries or groups of countries are not on the same page as regards to what trade agreements should be used for, or more specifically, what PTAs should be used for. And part of that was, a few countries in the GATT debates that I mentioned earlier on, while the opinion that trade agreements can be used, or trade policy can be a little bit more useful in pursuing environmental policy objectives. But there was very strong objection from emerging economies and maybe least developed countries, who argued that trade agreements should deal with trade issues. Environmental issues should be dealt with through multilateral environmental agreements. So there should be that separation. And so it's very interesting to see how parts of that debate played out. From the graph at the bottom, you can see a small select group of countries, especially the US, or states, especially the US, EU, and Canada, had a sort of almost 70% of their PTAs including environment first clauses. But this was less than half in emerging economies and in the LDCs. So you can see the pattern here, where a certain group of countries or states is driving the process, and most of the other groups of countries are not necessarily on the same page. So I turn to statistical analysis to try and pick out what are some of those factors that are driving that trend that we're seeing of greening PTAs. So the first thing I did, of course, was to identify some of those factors which we call explanatory variables. And I developed an original data set from those 269 PTAs, because I read them all and I coded those clauses in the two categories. They are finer categories, but for the purposes of this presentation, I've just presented the two: trade first and environment first. And then I also looked at now the explanatory variables from our theory. I looked at the aspect of policy spillovers, and I looked at the aspect of adjustment cost, and I categorized my variables in those two categories. So looking at the statistical model, I turned to, because I'm very much interested in the issue of diffusion. Is there diffusion of environment first clauses in PTAs? And of course, diffusion means change over time. We see a trend where something starts with a small group, but then it sort of gets taken up by everyone else over time. So the best statistical tool was a time to event model or survival analysis. And survival analysis, the idea behind it is very simple. You look at some factors at time zero, 1990. what was their influence back then? And over time, are they losing their influence or significance, or are they increasing? So you can pick out the factors that are driving the greening of PTAs and when they were strongest and when they are weakest. So that is a very important insight we can get. So change over time. And finally, as I've mentioned, the sort of statistical technique helps us to see whether there's a diffusion effect. So what do we see? So I'll focus on the environment first clauses because I think that's most important for our purposes here. And I had two types of environment first clauses. The first was the use of incentives. What did countries try to sort of include incentives in their PTAs to try and entice other states to consider using PTAs more proactively to pursue environmental policy objectives. So I presented here a curve that shows a graph that shows the analysis. The interpretation is very simple. On the x-axis is the time of the analysis, so going from left to right. Left is the old sort of earlier times, right is the more recent times. And on the vertical axis is the strength of the factors or independent variables. So the higher the curve, the stronger the influence of the factors. And as you go towards right, if we see the curves are falling, that means there's a diffusion effect. So to aid with the interpretation of the first curve, so we can see curve number one, which I call sort of the hegemon, or the really dominant states who have been driving this process. We see initially PTAs from US, EU, and Canada were more likely to include incentives, and that includes maybe encouraging countries to use voluntary systems, giving some financial support to countries to help them implement the environmental commitments in their PTAs. But over time, you can see that curve falling, and that means that many other PTAs started picking up that trend. So it was no longer specific to the US, EU, Canada, but many other countries picked up. And that is not surprising because if you remember, the compromise of the WTO was a win-win approach. And some of the incentives, for example, using, like encouraging more trade in environmental goods and services means you have more trade, of course, but you also have trade in environmental goods and services, which would help to deal with the environment. So there's a very big preference for incentives. And you can see over time, they became the very popular option. But if you look at another option, which is sort of forum shopping, which countries are trying to use, especially the enforcement mechanisms of the PTA, to try and get better compliance on, for example, implementation of MES. We have a very interesting trend. I'll ask you to focus your attention on the very three top trends, and that is, the curves on the OECD membership, regulatory quality, and rule of law. A very simple interpretation of that is that OECD members initially, PTAs with OECD members were initially more likely to have those strong environment first commitments in their PTAs. But over time, that got taken up by many other countries. So, and it's not surprising because there's a lot of evidence to show that OECD countries are having that debate on how trade agreements should be used to, get stronger compliance because it was difficult getting that through MES. But there's a very interesting fact. When I dug into the analysis, I looked at the two sort of types of enforcement, because the big attraction of the trade agreements, especially including PTAs, is that if you don't comply with the obligations, then there are punitive measures, including sanctions. And I was very curious to see whether states were actually tying commitments to environmental policy objectives with the sanctions or enforcement mechanisms from the PTAs. What was really surprising was most countries avoided using that enforcement mechanism of especially sanctions to enforce environmental policy objectives. So you could see the decoupled enforcement of trade obligations and environmental obligations, which was very telling because much of the literature in international political economy and especially rationalist literature on the design of institutions would say, if you're having problems with getting compliance or enforcement in multilateral environmental agreements, and trade agreements have a stronger enforcement mechanism, then let's shift environmental issues to trade agreements, and then we can get better compliance. But that seems through enforcement, that seems not to be the case. And for me, that was one of the really big findings, where countries are fine shifting issues to trade agreements, but they're decoupling the enforcement mechanism of the trade obligation from the environmental obligations. So the bigger approach was pointing to MES, like let's implement what we've committed to MES. And number two, let us not relax our domestic environmental standards, but very rarely were there sort of connections between attaching costs to non-compliance. I think that sort of sums up my analysis on the design of trade agreements, but international agreements are not designed to be kept in a shelf. They're designed to be implemented. And so what happens in practice when countries try to implement the commitments that are included in their PTAs? So I looked at an in-depth case study of the East African community. And I think before I outline what the East African community is per se and what I looked at, I think it's good to give you an impression of sort of like the regional dynamics. And first, of course, the East African community is in Africa. And just to give you, to underscore the significance of the region, which many people usually overlook, Africa is a very big place. So think about, how many countries you can fit. Very simple way, it's like 3 times the size of the US. Or in a more dramatic fashion, you can describe, you can fit in China. You can fit in another China. You can fit in the USA, India, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and as someone wittily mentioned, you can sneak in Great Britain, but we all know nowadays Britain doesn't have an appetite for joining unions, but you get the point. It's a very big place. So the East African community is a group of, I think, 6 countries which are on the eastern side of the continent. And the East African community itself is a preferential trade agreement. And the countries are Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, Rwanda, and Burundi. So why should we care about this area as a case study? Number one, it's one of the areas that is quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So that's why I picked climate policy as the environmental issue of focus. That's a very rapidly growing population, currently at 177 million. It has a small GDP as of now, but that is very important when you look at the role of trade policy it will be playing. So over the last decades, the region, African region by and large, has been sort of the focus of underdevelopment. And there's been huge reliance on aid, but in the last few years, there's been push towards a move from aid to trade. So trade policy is very important in the economic transformation of the region. So looking at how trade policy is now very important for economic development and the impacts of climate change, this makes a very interesting region to look at in terms of what role trade policy is playing in terms of pursuing climate policy objectives. But perhaps more interesting is the fact that if you recall the debates that I mentioned in the early 1990s, these countries were very prominent in sort of opposing the environmental agenda in trade negotiations. Their argument was, in trade negotiations should deal with trade issues. Environmental issues should be dealt with in multilateral environmental agreements. So it's very surprising then what happened that these countries changed their mind and decided to use their trade agreement, their PTA, to actually pursue climate policy objectives. As we shall see, so I went to Arusha, Tanzania, which is the headquarters of the East African community, and I conducted some interviews, and I also dug into archival material, and I found much of that material had been untouched, but it told us a lot. So I'll share with you some of the highlights of that story. And more importantly, I also leveraged my professional expertise in the area as a researcher, but also I was involved in climate diplomacy at the regional and international level. So I thought there was a lot that was happening that would be interesting to our study, but also for sharing and contributing to the broader literature. So what is the story of the EAC? So the EAC was founded in 1999. That was the 4th attempt. Decades before, there were different iterations of it. And in its founding treaty, there was a separate MOU for cooperation on environment and management. So that was a very interesting move because these countries had opposed sort of having the environmental agenda in trade negotiations, but here they concluded a PTA and they included an MOU on environment. Next, these countries strengthened that sort of commitment by developing a legal instrument that would bind them to addressing environmental issues. And that was a protocol on natural environment and resources. So from that, we can conclude that these countries tried to get sort of like generate positive policy spillovers by using the PTA to actively pursue environmental policy objectives. And then in 2009, between 2005 and 2009, and a couple of years later, a couple of regional climate policies were developed. And so you could see the member states trying to really actively address climate policy issues, and they developed a range of instruments. So it was a very active time sort of in those couple of years. And then when we moved to 2020, something interesting happened. And there was a big debate, there was a very ambitious climate change program, but there were no sufficient resources to match, especially from the member states. So much of the financing came from donors, especially from the EU and from the US. So we had a very ambitious program. These countries were committed to the climate policy agenda, but they were really struggled with high institutional costs. So much of the cost, up to 97%, was offset by donors. So you can see now here the positive policy spillovers are being generated, but also the adjustment costs are quite high and quite constraining. Something more dramatic happened in 2012. So the EU was negotiating a trade agreement with the region, the East African Community, but then there was a fallout. And one of the key reasons of the fallout for the agreement, where the EU could not agree with the East African Community on a PTA, were concerns over the sanctioned enforcement of MES. So in the proposed treaty, of course, the EU is very strong in using their trade agreements to sort of promote the implementation of MES. But the perception from the East African Community was, they'd be sort of, their hands would be tied and they might be penalized for not fulfilling their MEA commitments. So a bit of irony is in there, because the EU was a big supporter of the climate change program in the East African Community. But then when they changed that form of support, trying to shift from giving resources for the implementation of institutions to tying some costs for non-compliance with MEAs, that was a no-no for the EAC member states. So that was one of several reasons that led to the collapse of the agreement. That was unprecedented. But then, so the question was then, did these countries stop caring about environmental issues? Quite the opposite. And after the famous Paris Agreement was adopted and each of the countries submitted its NDC, that's nationally determined contribution, the East African Community member states actually formed a mechanism for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And they sort of, the mode that they used to ensure compliance was coordination, where they'd share best practices, they'd coordinate and try to make sure that each country is implementing its climate policy commitments. But they also developed an institution to try and sort of leverage a lot of financing from the international system to try and offset the very high costs that they were facing in implementing the ambitious climate agenda. What is very interesting about all this is, there have been several trade disputes in the region. Some countries have applied sanctions to others for alleged non-compliance with trade obligations, but not once have they tied non-implementation of the environmental, specifically climate change commitments, with sanctions. So it's a very different approach towards pursuing climate policy. It's not about sanctions per se or enforcement, but it's more about coordination, which sort of from a theoretical point of view also raises some very interesting questions about this very interesting strategy that differs significantly from what we've seen in some other regions. So having looked at all that empirical material, looking at the theory, what can we sort of conclude from this? So I'll first summarize and try to answer the question. So are trade agreements, especially PTAs, a vice or a virtue in pursuing environmental policy objectives? First, the first summary, or one of the key things that emerges from my study, which confirms also some of the broader trends, is that the role of trade policy in global environmental governance is becoming quite important. So a lot of attention is now being paid. We have countries really struggling to address the global environmental crisis, but then trade policy is a very powerful instrument. So what role will it play going forward to try and boost the environmental governance agenda? And more specifically, many PTAs, especially the most recent one, including environmental clauses, should that be a source of optimism? I think what we should remember first is, PTAs are still safeguarding the core principles of the trade agreements, which is the issue of, making sure there's no discrimination, there's transparency, etc. But we can see many more PTAs including an environment-first approach, which is a very interesting trend. Third, there seems to be an emerging consensus on using PTAs to pursue environmental policy objectives. That's why we're seeing all those environmental sort of first clauses. But adjustment costs remain a main issue. Countries are not going all the way and leveraging the enforcement mechanism of the PTAs to try and enhance compliance in environmental policy objectives, which raises very interesting questions. Why are they not going all the way to leverage that enforcement mechanism? With the exception of maybe US, Canada, and EU, and maybe a few other states, as I've mentioned, like states are not going all the way and using the enforcement mechanism of the PTAs. And where the enforcement mechanisms exist, the preference is over, for example, reiterating the need to implement MES, but not actually including commitments that go over and beyond the MES. And that is opposed sort of to the expectation, especially theoretical expectation, that countries would actually leverage the mechanisms of the PTA, either through sanctions or attaching costs for non-compliance to enhance compliance in environmental policy. So that is a very interesting sort of topic, and there's a very interesting emerging sort of research on the use of coordination that is setting standards, whether it's domestic or international, as opposed to attaching costs for compliance in trade agreements, and that's especially in the field of IPE. So it's a very long presentation. It's quite a detailed presentation. If you forget everything else that I've presented, I want you to remember these three things. These are the three take-home messages that I have for you. The first one is that as global challenges become more complex, linkage politics is becoming a prevalent and defining feature of international politics. Just look at the COVID-19 pandemic. The current discussions on, like for example, bailouts for COVID, bailouts for countries or for economies or companies, etc., in COVID, to address the economic downturn from COVID-19. Should the bailouts be tied to, for example, climate action? The EU has tied its bailout programs to environmental and climate change policies. So should other countries go down that route? So looking at COVID-19 and, if you insert any issue area of your choice, will be a very big sort of topic going forward. So linkage politics will become very important. Number two, which sort of we're seeing countries are falling short of their global commitments, but is big stick diplomacy the best approach to getting compliance, to getting countries to do what they're supposed to do? And I think that sort of, that's a long-standing question in literature and in policy as well. Which is the best approach? Do you use the sticks or do you use the carrots, which are incentives? So I think that debate is still out. I think the jury is still out on that, but I think that debate will intensify now, especially if you're having countries link issues. Third and important is now, fine, we're seeing all this, linkage politics is becoming important, but is it a pathway out of the gridlock we have in global governance? That's an open question, and I think going forward, it will be very interesting to see the promise and perils, or the promise and limits of, linkage politics in trying to address very intractable global challenges. So I think I'll end my presentation there, and sort of by emphasizing, from my study, the literature on regime interplay has talked a lot about, policy spillovers, what happens when policies from different issue areas interact. We haven't paid sufficient attention to adjustment costs, and especially number one, institutional costs, which has been a very big issue in international cooperation, especially for emerging countries, and domestic politics, even for wealthy countries who are trying to pursue some certain policies, but they're really constrained by the domestic politics. So I think that'll become a really, really interesting feature going forward. So I think I'll leave it at that and sort of say thank you. Asanteni, that's one of my languages, Swahili. And on this slide, I appreciate a lot of support that I've gotten getting to where I am today. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kennedy. That was an excellent, very clear presentation. Now we've got 20 minutes, and what I propose is that we take questions in sets of 3. So Kennedy, I hope you've got a pen, and that's great. So my understanding, so 3 or 4 people have posted questions on the chat, and a few people have their hand up. So what I'll do, my understanding is that I basically click on a name to allow someone to talk. And I'm going to do that first to Lucas Granger-Brown, who was the first person to post a question. So Lucas, can you go ahead?
Hello. G'day, Kennedy. Thanks very much for that presentation. That was really good and very professional. Nice to see such a really good presentation. Just really quickly, I was really interested by your breaking out the hegemon category of the data set. And I was wondering, given that sort of awareness of political economy in your presentation, whether you have some sort of metric or proxy that might help you estimate the authenticity of the environment first clauses, particularly given the sort of questionable history of the Washington consensus in strong-arming weaker bargaining partners into sort of following what the hegemon wants with maybe behind the back dealings, if you wish.
Okay, thanks, Lucas. The next person I've got on the list, Stephen Pollard. Stephen?
Yes, thanks, Kenny. That was great presentation. Really good to see you this far along the PhD journey. Congratulations. I have a question on your research methodology, which is how you developed your theoretical framework, the sort of trade first, environment first, the positive, negative spillovers and the adjustment costs, and whether that was something that you sort of entered into your analysis of 260 odd PTAs, or whether the theoretical framework was something that took shape through that process of conducting your empirical analysis. Thanks again.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And then finally, Siegfried Ungerer. Can you go ahead, and then I'll take another round of 3 after that, after Kennedy's answered.
Thank you, Kennedy, for a great presentation. Your conclusion is interesting, in particular because it raises questions. For example, what is the green finance imperative behind EU, Canada, and US requirements for green MEAs at a professional level, and talking from a point of view of someone who does these sort of things. And my posted question to you was, how do you structure an Article 6 policy framework response with consideration to the current energy commodity market practices and issues? Article 6 response frameworks are the current issue for most developing and emerging nations. And these are imperative with PTAs, because you can't have a trade agreement if you don't have an Article 6 policy framework response at national level.
Okay. Right, so Kennedy, if you can provide reasonably succinct answers to those 3 very good but also quite large questions, then I'll move on to a second round after you do that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So I think starting with the first question by Lucas, it's a very interesting question, and I think to do that, I dug a little bit into a lot of archival work, and I drew a lot on sort of existing literature. And I tried to, in my analysis, to, for example, look at, what the hegemonic, like the major economies I mentioned, US, EU, or Canada, the only ones that were sort of pushing, this agenda. And in part of my analysis, I looked at other big economies, and I realized sort of for the three states, US, EU, and Canada, they were the ones who were really driving this process. So whether they were enjoying or leveraging their bargaining power, I think that is almost obvious, because these are issues they've been advocating for the last couple of decades, and it's easier for them to get sort of those outcomes, from PTAs as compared to the multilateral system. And especially the US has used a very aggressive system of sort of even attaching sanctions, but the EU has used a little bit of a softer system. So I think maybe I'll leave that on there. For Stephen, I think it's very interesting, the question you've raised, because initially when I looked at when I started looking at the PTAs in the initial phase of my program, I realized, I see environment mentioned in the agreements, but it was mentioned in different contexts. So of course, the first puzzle was theoretical, what are these? Why do we have the different approaches, And that's why sort of from a theoretical point of view, I sort of picked those which were trying to mitigate a conflict between trade and environment. I called it trade first and the environment first. So in my thesis, I developed a full chapter of the theory, including applying the logic behind sort of how I plan it. So, but for the purposes of the presentation, I kept it very simple. But it was a process, that went through the empirics and back to theory, trying to refine the theory. And finally, to Siegfried, I think I missed sort of like the gist of your question per se, but I hope I do it justice by answering my understanding of it. And so the question would be, I think when we have this green imperative, when you're trying to use PTAs to push the green agenda, the question would be, there's a consensus, yes, on, the need to address environmental issues. But I think the bigger thing would be the costs, institutional and domestic. For countries that rely a lot on fossil fuels, you can imagine the domestic politics would be really hard in implementing, whether it's clean energy policy or climate policy. But for others, the constraint might not be domestic policy or interest groups per se, but the institutional resources of trying to coordinate all that. So I hope I've done justice to your question, but happy to have a follow-up later on if I didn't.
Siegfried, did you want to quickly come back on that, or are you happy to leave it there for the moment?
Look, thank you, Kennedy. I think your answer really shows that you are in the beginning of your research, because the current practices response for emerging nations is to formulate a policy framework, notwithstanding that there are energy commodity market concerns and that it may in actual fact be used as a different trade agenda between, quite separate from any other trade agreement. The very simple fact is that unless you can have a policy framework response to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, you simply cannot include it in a trade agreement. It is a contradiction in terms, because Article 6 is about individual countries formulating their policy framework.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, but I think I should be also clear on what I looked at and most importantly, what I did not look at, because the good thing is there are very many interesting questions out there, but I have, there are limits to scope. So I think that's a more specific question which sort of lays out the scope of my analysis. But I think raised a very interesting point on what is happening in the Paris, and might it be consistent with trade agreements or inconsistent, as you've mentioned, through what you call contradiction, which in a way might be seen as a policy conflict. So that is a more specific issue that sort of lies outside the scope of my study. But I do agree that going forward that'll be a very sort of important issue. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Kennedy. John Robert had a question. John, do you want to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Kennedy, for a terrific presentation. My question is a little bit outside of it, a bit based on my experience as a chemical engineer and a commerce graduate. And I worked for a while, apart from petrochemicals mostly in my career, but I did spend almost a decade with the Australian Trade Commission. And was on the sidelines of trade agreements between Australia and Finland and Saudi Arabia when I was posted there. But I was more a promotions type trade commissioner than a policy. But I'm just interested that since Brexit, there's upcoming trade agreements to be negotiated between Britain or UK and Australia, and between the EU and Australia. And I wonder what the chances are of the EU pushing, and Britain pushing strongly in those negotiations for much better environment policies on Australia's part, and at least a stop to the rather sabotaging tactics displayed by Australia at the last COP or couple of COP conferences. Mm. I guess that's about it. And if the answer is yes, there is something, there might be a chance of doing that. What can us retired activists perhaps do to make it more likely to happen?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, John. Kennedy, if you've got that question, I had one myself. I don't see any other names up, but if you want to raise your hand, please do so. My question, Kennedy, was about the coding of your PTAs between trade first and environment first. Mm-hmm. And of course, PTAs are multi-country endeavours and ultimately agreements if they're successful. It seems as though your trade versus environment first coding is trying to get at the underlying motivations behind these agreements. But of course, the motivations may differ substantially across the parties to the negotiation. It may be that one party has trade first objectives and another party has environment first objectives. And the outcome may be very dependent, as you've alluded to, on the relative power of the parties in the agreement. And indeed, the last questioner was implicitly asking a question about power too. So how do you deal with that potential motivation and preference mismatch between the parties? Because you're coding an outcome that may not match the preferences of all the parties to the agreement. Does anybody else, so we've got 2 questions on the floor. We can let Kennedy, in the absence of someone else putting their hand up, let Kennedy, you go ahead and answer those 2.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are 2 really good questions, and I'll start with John's question. And I think it's a very fascinating question that you raised, and that shows, for example, the policy salience of the issue. Maybe I'll speak first about the EU-Australia ongoing trade negotiations, which is very interesting. And of course, the EU has that particular stance, they'll not sign an agreement, a trade agreement with any country that, or any state that is not upholding its Paris commitments. So initially, Australia had a stance where they did not want the argument was as other states have raised earlier on, climate change issues should be dealt with in the Paris Agreement. Trade agreements should deal with trade issues. But what is interesting now, like for example, Australia's brief on negotiation brief on the trade agreement is Australia has agreed to address, for example, climate change issues, but they've tied that to to the Paris Agreement and nothing over and beyond what is there in the Paris Agreement. And that is very interesting because if you recall my discussion of countries preferring international or domestic standards as opposed to attaching cost to non-compliance, that is the approach that Australia is using. So we can see, for example, in principle, they're saying, fine, we'll have climate change issues in the trade agreement, but they've tied that to the Paris Agreement, which Australia has a contribution, a nationally determined contribution, and they do not want to go over and beyond what they've committed to Paris. So that is part of the broader trend that I identified, where countries are saying, fine, if we are to deal with environmental issues or climate change issues, then we will use multilateral environmental agreements such as Paris Agreement as the international standards as a focal point, and they coordinate around that. But they are very wary of tying, for example, the use of trade sanctions to enforce the implementation of those mechanisms. So I can speculate that Australia will go the farthest Australia will go from what they've articulated so far in their negotiation brief is that they will go the Paris Agreement approach because they formulated their own Paris Agreement contribution. But then they will be very resistant to any commitments over and beyond what is there in Paris. So I think the second point about what would activists do, as per my theory, I'd say, gotten to the point where there's now the policy spillover, fine, let's use this trade agreement to address climate change issues. But then the bigger issue is the adjustment costs. And in this case, it seems domestic politics is the main issue. So I think any policy responses or any strategies would have to deal with the question of domestic politics, which is really pronounced in that case. And now finally, to go to Andrew's question, it's a very interesting question. And I think I had a very big challenge when I was coding those PTAs. So I do have more specific 4 categories, which because I have a 2x2 matrix, for policy spillovers and adjustment costs, but I had to do quite a number of trade-offs. And part of that was trying to look at, PTAs, as we've mentioned, are negotiated outcomes. So countries have, different preferences. So pinpointing the exact preferences for the hundreds of agreements was very difficult. So I had a very judicious approach, and I picked out some of the key things. For example, if we look at, bargaining power, we find, PTAs that had a bigger bargaining power or bigger power differential being more likely to, go for certain types of, commitments, maybe stronger environment first commitments or otherwise. I also looked at, like differences in environmental, protection, where, if there's very big differences in the levels of domestic environmental protection, then we might sort of see maybe a bigger, we might see a stronger concern for environment. So there are many trade-offs, and part of that was, like, I really appreciated the limitations that, we can gain from, large end studies. They can show us something, but they cannot show us everything. So, and that's part of the reason why I included a case study, to really be able to dig deep and pick out some of these dynamics, how they play out in practice. So that was the limitation for my main sort of large end studies. But then I also suggest in my study, we need more case studies in the different regions to pick out the different dynamics and how they play through, especially, mixed methods and very clear process tracing. But yeah, that's a limitation that I appreciate and acknowledge in my study.
Yeah. Okay, Kennedy, I'm afraid, and everyone else, I'm afraid, that we're pretty much out of time. Obviously, we can't show our appreciation to Kennedy and his excellent presentation and responses in the traditional way, but I would very much encourage you, if you have further questions or suggestions, to direct those to Kennedy. Just wondering, Kennedy, if you've put up your email address, but in any case, we can get that to you if you get in touch with us and you can't find Kennedy's email. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you very much to Kennedy, and best of luck with the finalization of your thesis, Kennedy, and the submission process.
And thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for your wonderful comments and support. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much, everyone.